KIN223, Chapter 10, still on leadership. And we're in book presentation number 2. And we're talking sport-oriented interactional approaches to leadership. So we're going to get going on this. A coach needs to consider the people and the environment when accepting a leadership role. Does it make sense for a particular coach to jump into a role that is not aligned with their personal beliefs or aligned with their skill set and ability? It becomes a question of a coach needs to understand who they're going to be working with, the athletes they're going to be interacting with, and the environment that they're going to be in. And it's absolutely critical for the success of everybody involved. And they list two main leadership models, one of which is transformational and servant leader. There are, I'm sure we can subcategorize into many others, but these are the two main ones that the book goes into. With the cognitive meditational model of leadership, they emphasize that relationships among situational cognitive behavioral and individual difference variables. It's the emphasis, or the relationship between these things, if I can get it out. They're talking about how these things all kind of interact within the coaching environment and affect each other. They're not all mutually exclusive. They are absolutely intertwined. And they have different degrees of effect within that context. And the coaching behaviors themselves, they vary as a function of these different situational factors in athletics, whether it's the level of competition in a particular sport, the athletes you're working with. Even if you go in as a change agent to take over somebody else's program, the culture that was instilled by that former coach matters 100%. It should also include the cognitive processes and individual personality differences. And you have to take that into account because you might have a divide between these components of the cognitive and personality components of your athletes, and you're constantly kind of being typecast as the lovable losers, the ones who do okay. You just get by, you hope for 500 plus a game, and 500 meaning win half your games plus one game. And then all of a sudden a coach comes in and they start talking about we want to win 75% of our games or better, and we want to go to a bowl game, or we want to win a conference championship. That's going to cause a little cognitive dissonance, right, with your athletes who are there, because they're going to have to process that the expectation and for their organization and the culture has changed. And it's no longer about mediocrity, it's about being elite. They elaborate further that the attributes of the players towards their coach are affected by the perception and recall of the coach's behavior. And I think there's some truth to this, and there's some truth to the fact that when athletes do better, they like their coaches better. When athletes are part of a program that does better, they like their coaches better. But there is no doubt. I mean, I've had some coaches who were just absolute monsters and forced me in a very authoritative way to get out of my comfort zone, and it was not fun. And it was a pretty challenging 2 years of dealing with this person. But I will admit, as much as I can't stand the person, they helped me grow and evolve as an athlete. And I never would have had that evolution anywhere in my life had I not met that person. So I will tell you that I became better as an athlete as a direct result of a coach that did not have a very positive affect and did not have a very positive coaching style with his athletes. I can tell you that definitively. So how much an athlete likes their coach or believes they are competent depends on their perception of the behavior of their coach. Was this gentleman competent? I'd say competent enough. Was he competent in the terms of psychology of coaching? No. Did he coach from a place of beating on his athletes and inflicting and imposing his will into the process? Yes, absolutely. And I will tell you, I probably would shake this person's hand if I saw him, out and how you doing? But I have no desire to get to know him other than that. But I definitely became a better athlete because of this coach. So they introduced the coaching behavioral assessment system, the CBAS, if you want to be fancy. And with this, they divide behavior in two main areas, and I'm kind of sketch on this. You have reactive and spontaneous, and you'll hear why. Reactive are the responses specific to the behavior of the player, and as like when a coach instructs an error. And then spontaneous, those are initiated by the coach. They describe it in the book as they're initiated by the coach. For example, a coach who might yell encouragement to his players as they go out onto the field. I don't know if I'd classify that too much as spontaneous per se, but it's not reacting to a behavior of the athlete. So I kind of see where they're going, but that to me, as an outsider trying to teach this, I could see where that would be a little bit confusing, right? So just realize that spontaneous behaviors are not dependent upon the behavior, or not dependent upon the behavior of a player. Those are reactive. You're reacting to something the player did. Nice job, way to pull that rebound. Good job, fielding that ball, whatever it may be. Whereas spontaneous behaviors don't have anything to do with any kind of input into the system from the athlete. I think that's okay the way they did it in the book. Now, positive behaviors that they say 66% can be categorized into the following, so meaning 2/3. Positive reinforcement, right? General technical, and then general encouragement. Now, I'll tell you that like general technical, that could end up being negative, right? But as a coach, you get better at being able to deliver positive content at greater ratios to negative content. So I'll just say this, when you do these, realize that the exact opposite is negative reinforcement, negative feedback regarding general technical instruction, and general discouragement, which is kind of inherent to the coach that I was just referring to. All right, so let's take a look at this. When they look at these two different studies, and in one study, players with low self-esteem who had a supportive and instructive coach, expressed the highest level of attraction toward coaches. So if we look at this, you have a supportive and instructive coach who had low self-esteem. They end up plotting out on the graph over here. Now, if you have a player with low self-esteem who had a less supportive and less instructive coach, they have the least amount of attraction to the coaches. And where I'm going with this is that would be over here. What you'd like to have is, even if you have somebody who has low self-esteem, you'd like to be more supportive for that person. And your goal is to help them become more confident in their ability, and they're no longer down here with low self-esteem. You're starting to build them up eventually to the point where you're supportive and instructive and they have high self-esteem. Now, granted, some people are just wired to have negative self-talk and they'll end up having low self-esteem, but you as a coach can do things to take your athletes from down here graphically to more up in this quadrant up here. And it becomes a conversation of how you do these things, how you implement training, how you implement programming, how you actually articulate things to your athletes, right, to help them along. Now, the effectiveness of a leader will vary depending upon the characteristics of the athletes and the constraints of a situation. And this falls under the multidimensional model of sport leadership. And this is a pretty good example in terms of how you can have these different components that all factor in. And they suggest that leader effectiveness will depend on characteristics of the athletes and the constraints of a situation, and the satisfaction and performance depend upon three types of leader behavior. And these are what are required, what are actual, and preferred. So every time you have a leader in a coaching environment, there's a required behavior that you have to be a coach. That can be different than the actual behavior that the coach implements, and that can be different than what the preferred behavior is of the athletes. And I would also say that maybe there's one more in here that they're not really touching on, but best practices. And I think best practices would be very hard to define, because that would be defined by the situation, time, place, the environment, the athletic program, the athletes, the former coaches, all the things that we've talked about in every other presentation. But specific in the book, they talk about required, actual, and preferred. the way they map this out, this is okay. It's a little bit janky, if I can use that terminology, but you have these different characteristics between situational leader and member, and then the leader itself has a required behavior based upon the situation, a required behavior that would be a best of fit in a situation. But many times coaches just don't do that, and they have an actual behavior that they implement, good or bad, and they have athletes, who are the members in this one, have a preferred behavior that they would like to have. And there's a constant back and forth that happens between what actually happens and the performance and satisfaction of the athletes. So you're constantly running back and forth between these two based off the actual behavior. And then you have this kind of balance, if you will, between what should happen, what is required of that situation, and preferred by the athletes. Now, I will tell you, sometimes what is preferred is not best for outcomes. And I will tell you, sometimes what is required can be very nebulous and hard to nail down what that is, but that should be required for best outcomes. And you're left to ask the question of, what are best outcomes? To support my student athletes, to help them grow as young men and women to be able to go off into the world? Or is the required behavior to be able to be outcome oriented and win a championship? Kind of depends, right? So just depending upon what you have for required behavior and what your athletes prefer, the actual behavior will dictate performance and the satisfaction of the athletes. So with this, the positive outcome is most likely if there are three aspects, the three aspects of behavior agree. If they behave appropriately for the particular situation and it matches the preferences of the group members, then you'll have a positive outcome, the most positive outcome. But I would say you'd have to have a really good understanding of the people that are on your team. You've probably recruited some of those people into your team. Those individuals already know the culture, and they already know that your culture is to operate at elite level and excel in your division or your conference or in the country. And ultimately, it gets down to the conversation of Saban, right driver, right vehicle, right passengers, pointed in the right direction. And you're trying to leverage all these behaviors correctly to be able to have a positive outcome. I would urge you to take a look at this. I believe it's on the 230 side of the page here, not the 231, but you'll get there either way. I thought this was really good in terms of some behavioral cues that you can use and some things just to kind of keep in your mind when you're working with athletes in terms of corrective feedback, how you implement. When you talk with your athletes, are you punishing them? Are you encouraging them? Are you nagging your athletes? Are you providing encouragement? How so? It's a matter of what you say and how you say it. So I would urge you to look at this list. And with that, guys, I'm going to jump over to the next presentation.